West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
So I have two readings today, and the first one is from a book I suspect many people here may have heard of, called The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is a well-known treatise by Jane Jacobs, a non-professional urban planner. She wrote as a sort of railing against the excesses of modernist planners in New York and other American cities in the post-war era, which really has taken on its own life to become a story of how cities work and how they improve our lives and how embedded in them we are. And so this is where I wanted to start. And so this is from an entire chapter she wrote on the subject of sidewalks, which I still find endlessly fascinating, much to Ruth's permanent chagrin. And so I thought it was a good way to start framing today. So this is her describing life in Greenwich Village in the 1960s. So under the seeming disorder of the old city, wherever the old city is working successfully, is a marvelous order for maintaining the safety of the streets and the freedom of the city. It is a complex order. Its essence is intricacy of sidewalk use, bringing with it a constant succession of eyes. This order is all composed of movement and change, and although it is life, not art, we may fancifully call it the art form of the city and liken it to the dance, not to a simple-minded precision dance with everyone kicking up at the same time, twirling in unison, and bowing off en masse, but to an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have distinctive parts which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. The ballet of the good city sidewalk never repeats itself from place to place, and in any one place is always replete with new improvisations. The stretch of Hudson Street where I live is each day the scene of its own intricate sidewalk ballet. I make my own first entrance into it a little after 8, when I put out my garbage can, surely a prosaic occupation, but I enjoy my part, my little clang, as the junior droves of junior high school students walk by the center of the stage, dropping candy wrappers. While I sweep up the wrappers, I watch the other rituals of the morning. Mr. Halpert unlocking the laundry's handcart from its mooring to a cellar door, Joe Cornacia's son-in-law stacking out the empty crates from the delicatessen, the barber bringing out his sidewalk folding chair, Mr. Goldstein arranging the coils of wire which proclaim the hardware store's open, the wife of the tenant's superintendent depositing her chunky 3-year-old with a toy mandolin on the stoop, the vantage point from which he is learning English his mother cannot speak. Now the primary children, heading for St. Luke's, gerbil through the south, the children from St. Veronica's Cross, heading to the west, and the children from Public School 41, heading toward the east. 2 new entrances are made from the wings. Well-dressed and even elegant women and men with briefcases emerge from doorways and side streets. Most of these are heading for the bus and the subways, but some hover on the curbs, stopping taxis which have miraculously appeared at the right moment, for the taxis are part of a wider morning ritual. Having dropped passengers from Midtown in the downtown financial district, they are now bringing downtowners up to Midtown. Simultaneously, numbers of women in house dresses have emerged, and as they crisscross with one another, they pause for quick conversations that sound with laughter or jointed indignation. Never, it seems, anything in between. It is time for me to hurry to work too, and I exchange my ritual farewell with Mr. LaFaro, the short, thick-bodied, white-aproned fruit man who stands outside his doorway a little up the street, his arms folded, his feet planted, looking solid as the earth itself. We nod, we each glance quickly up and down the street, and then look back at each other and smile. We've done this many a morning for more than 10 years, and we both know what it means. All is well. The heart of the day ballet I seldom see, because part of the nature of it is that working people who live there, like me, are mostly gone, filling the roles of strangers on other sidewalks. But from days off, I know enough to know that it becomes more and more intricate. Longshoremen not working that day gather at the White Horse or the Ideal or the International for beer and conversation. The executives and business lunchers from the industries just to the west throng the Dorgeen restaurant and the Lion's Head Coffee House. Meat market workers and communication scientists together fill the bakery lunchroom. It's a bit of an awkward place to end it, but what I want to, and am I supposed to comment on it at this point? Okay. What I want to draw your attention to here is that this is a story about strangers, and that this is not a story where we know a single person in the telling. We don't know anything about them except what they look like and where they are. And within that is, I think, an intimacy that I'm going to come back to talking later, but which is deeply important in the building of community. And I'll leave it there. So that takes us to the second reading, and where this previous one was, I think, kind of poetic and beautiful in its own way. Here is a great reflection that no academic in the world has ever learned to write well or interestingly. This is from a study by a team of economists working in the UK who work on sort of the political implications of housing costs. Very interesting work, just written as dense as anything. So in this, they've studied several European countries, all of which are going through housing crises not unlike Canada's, and they've been interested in what that means for how these people relate to their governments, to their countries, to their neighbors and their communities. And what they've found, I think, is deeply concerning. So I'll start at the conclusion. What are the broader theoretical lessons of these findings? And I'll pause here to say that when academics mean theoretical, they mean what's actually matter about this. One is that house prices have a significant impact on social policy preferences and voting behavior, not only in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. We find that growing unaffordability creates support for less government intervention in labor market inequality or housing, and consequently, more support for the political right. We argue that this result is driven by homeowners seeking to protect their gains of appreciation from being taxed away or undermined by growing housing supply. We show that this is not simply a function of places with higher incomes having more expensive property. The ratio of housing costs to incomes is a core factor driving the shift in preferences. Another lesson concerns the consequences of wealth inequality for political polarization. Even if, on average, rising affordability reduces the demand for intervention, that may not be the case for renters locked out of booming markets. Rising unaffordability drives a political wedge between owners and renters and may be an important contributor, and here again I'll pause when people say maybe, they mean it absolutely is, but I couldn't get that through peer review, may be an important contributor to the growth of political polarization, including that typically attributed to age. As somebody else shows in this special issue, homeownership is particularly unequally distributed among the young, potentially detaching many younger Europeans from the housing market permanently, with major economic and political consequences. The political relevance of this type of polarization will of course depend on the ability of actors defined by their wealth to coalesce around housing policy. If income or labor market risk cut across the interests of homeowners, this might reduce the size of the anti-redistribution coalition. This is an incredibly counterintuitive way to say that if these problems matter to homeowners too, then it may not be such a big problem. But if, and we should expect to be the case, that they don't, and that age and homeownership are directly correlated, and directly informing political preferences, what we will find is an older, politically influential anti-redistribution group and a younger, politically non-influential pro-redistribution group. Cultural divides might also split homeowners from one another, as in the case of the Brexit divide, noted by our previous research, which has produced the unusual example of a Conservative Party toying with easing planning laws. I should have cut that section, it's not particularly important. But here's the important part. We conclude by noting the policy consequences of our argument and findings. In the medium run, growing housing unaffordability is likely to lead to greater success for far-right parties and less interest in redistribution, thereby underpinning the overall trend of rising property prices. Accordingly, the surge in house prices we have seen across Europe is self-reinforcing. The beneficiaries of unaffordability will prefer to keep policies and parties in place that keep prices high and rising. However, as we have seen, they do so at the cost of growing polarization between renters and owners. So, I regret this reading a little bit because I think they could have teased out the significance of this as they do in a separate article. But the significance of this and what I really want to, one of the things I really want to emphasize today is that when we talk about a housing crisis, as they're talking about in Europe, but which we can talk about to an even greater scale in Canada, what we're talking about is not just something that threatens affordability or welfare. We're talking about something that is increasingly threatening democratic norms, attachments to community, and attachments to each other. And so this is, I'm going to return to this again, talking, and not to sound like an excessive alarmist or Chicken Little here, but this is the key theme of significance that I really want to hammer home, and is why I chose this reading, is that this sort of having a place to call home and having a future to tie to your home is really obviously a key part of life. And as we're increasingly seeing, if people don't have that opportunity, the consequences for it can be tremendous.
Offered as wisdom for the journey.
May we walk in its light.
Now, two things. Who is this man talking to us so knowledgeably about housing? And so it's hard to ask someone to give a bio of themselves. Ruth Ann, could I ask you to come here for a moment? This will be a far better introduction to James than he would give himself. If you just give us a little background of James, as positive as you wish.
Darling, I was not prepared for this, so forgive me if I do it wrong. So James is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in political science, specifically studying housing and social welfare and many other things that branch off of that I don't quite understand. Prior to his academic career, he worked in theater and in tech, which is why he's so helpful on the back end of things as well, but also worked as an NDP, doing things for the NDP in a professional capacity very passionately, and I don't remember the job title because it was before we met. So sort of lived a political life and is now studying a political life.
I knew she would wax a little more eloquent than he would himself. But it's a pleasure to have you here, James, and to hit on such an important topic. Such an important topic if you think home to house, to home coming, home feeling. I'm going to say one thing, that the people on Zoom saw all of James, but I think the people here saw the upper half of his head, and the lower half of his head is just as interesting. So I'm going to ask maybe if... No, it's just that the flap up. Yeah, that's so... Is that better? You can see all of him. Okay, James, I'm just going to play you for a moment.
So again, like any good academic, I ignored the emails telling me what to do, so the slides may not work here today. But we'll see. So if I do this, then yes, this is the challenge. You can just kind of see me in the top corner on my screen. I guess the question is for folks on Zoom, is that feasible?
Yes, it works well.
Wonderful. All right. Okay. And so we'll do this. And does that pause my screen sharing? No, it works. Okay. Oh yeah, I can see it here. Great. So hello, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for having me today. I wrote this introduction without really thinking that I'd be doing the previous reading, so it's a little superfluous, but I'll be talking to you today about a subject near and dear to my heart, which is what I'm calling the pan-Canadian housing crisis, or the long Canadian housing crisis, and particularly the things that have caused it, its implications for Canadian society, and really the important bit, which is the ways in which people like you and I can help do something about it. So I have to admit, when I was asked to give this talk, I was a little bit stumped, and then I was a little bit intimidated by Ruth's deeply personal, heartfelt talk last week. I can promise you none of the same. And I thought, what could I bring to the table, particularly to sort of a diverse group of people united by a sense of community, would be interesting and worth their time. So to start this, I really started thinking about this community, and so I turned to the West Hill mission statement, which was maybe a mistake, because as an academic growing in wisdom, that makes a lot of sense to me. Grounded in life is not a strength of any university person, I think, nor I think as anybody who's ever been to a faculty meeting is growing in love. But I thought I would lean into that problem and try to take today and think about how to turn these things that are too often sort of academically grounded in dry, sort of unhelpful language, and think about what they mean for life, and communicate what they mean for life, and what we can do with love about them. So let's begin by talking through what we're going to do. So this is the introduction. We're going to talk briefly about what exactly the Canadian housing crisis consists of, because it's a term we hear a lot about, but is not one that I think ever really gets usefully explored or expounded upon. We'll talk a bit about the various things that have caused it, and particularly the things that have made it sort of unique in history as a housing crisis. Not to put too fine a point on it, but we'll also talk about why it's bad and the consequences for society it has. And then we'll talk briefly about what we can do about it. So, first of all, what we call a housing crisis, actually really has three components. And the first is rapidly rising home prices. And I apologize, I didn't have a chance to take this graph and isolate Canada in it. This is a list of every OECD country. One important takeaway from here is that these are dollar figures given in inflation-adjusted dollars. So if housing prices remain the same from 1990, the start of this graph, to 2020, we should expect to see flat lines. We see those almost nowhere. In fact, we only see them in Japan for reasons that I won't get into today. But everywhere in the world, housing is more expensive than it was. Be glad you don't live in New Zealand. That's the green line at the very top of this graph. But the plain black line, somewhere near the top, is Canada. And this is a real concern. Home prices in Canada have risen 1.5 times in the previous 3 decades. That is, a house that would have cost you $200,000 in 1990 would now cost you $500,000. This figure, of course, is a national average, and so it understates where this problem is concentrated, as I think people in Scarborough and Toronto more broadly know well. And again, these are inflation-adjusted dollars, so this isn't, wages have not moved at all to catch up with this. The second problem, the second facet of the housing crisis, of course, is rental prices. And as you can see, not much changes in this graph if we look at rents. Rental prices in Canada in the same time period have gone up by 60%. There are obvious costs to rising home prices, but we often ignore these because we think that people can be insulated by moving into the rental market. But what we see here is that that's not an option, that alternative, accessible, and affordable options have disappeared altogether. The official figures are in the last 30 years, rents have increased by 60% in real dollar figures. There's real reasons to disbelieve this and to think that it misses the true number. I think the real number is somewhere closer to 100%, as I think anybody who has rented an apartment in the last 10 years can probably tell you. And this is where the housing crisis really starts to become a crisis. If you can't afford a home, it's bad. It's bad for your long-term finances. It's not great. If you can't afford to rent, you can't afford to live. And what we've seen is a doubling in the share of income that those least able to afford it have had to give up to secure housing. And this leads to our third sort of component of the housing crisis, which is a dramatic increase in Canada's rates of homelessness. It is infamously difficult to get accurate numbers for homelessness as a sort of invisible phenomenon, especially because so much of it is not actually street homelessness, but populations in Toronto and elsewhere are inarguably growing. Toronto has expanded its shelter capacity tremendously in recent years and still cannot even hope to keep pace with the numbers of homelessness. More and more people, squeezed financially in too many different directions at once, have simply given up on being able to afford, that's the wrong phrasing, have simply been unable to afford their largest and most essential expense. More have been rent-evicted, once able to secure housing, and then kicked out, whether this be because their social housing units have closed due to disrepair, whether their illegal boarding rooms have been shut down, or whether they've been in apartments that landlords want to close and re-rent for more money. And one big challenge in housing and one big challenge in homelessness is that it's incredibly expensive to get new housing. Where it's very easy to maintain housing for some people, the costs of re-securing it are much higher, and so people end up homeless and unable to exit the situation. So these are, very quickly speaking, the three elements of today's housing crisis: rising home prices, rising rents, rising levels of homelessness. What makes today's crisis unique is not these things. These have all happened in the past. What makes it unique is the length, the scale of these things, and the reduced safety net that people have to rely on. I put my slide note in the wrong place, but that's okay. I'm sure many folks here remember other housing crises in the past: runaway price growth, double-digit mortgage interest rates in the 70s and 80s, booms, busts. What's unprecedented is that if we go back to our cost graph, beginning in roughly the year 2000, there's no bust here. There's no relief from rising prices. There's no market corrections. Housing is infamously cyclical, and something has happened that the cycle has been broken, that now prices just increase. And this is what we're going to talk about next. So what's actually going on here? What's caused the housing crisis? We might ask this question as, what has changed about the world and the way in which housing and housing markets operate, so that we now face some apparently new scale, new set of affordability and accessibility challenges, where once upon a time we could trust that these problems would eventually correct themselves. So broadly speaking, I would suggest that there are three sort of concurrent overlapping causes, and it's actually the simultaneity of these three things that has left us with this sort of new scale of crisis. The first cause, maybe the most obvious, is wide-scale social housing disinvestment. It's easy to forget, but as recently as the 1970s, Canada produced 200,000 social housing units a year, split between all three levels of government. These units provided an affordable place to live for millions of Canadians, but they also took considerable pressure off private housing markets and also tended to set prevailing market rental rates. In the 1980s, however, provincial governments began abandoning these in the name of fiscal austerity, and really the death blow of Canadian social housing was struck in 1993 when the federal government ended supports for all new projects. As a result, we've gone from a peak of 200,000 units a year to settling into an average of approximately 10,000, which have had to house, obviously, a much larger population. And in fact, as a result, those 10,000 units are not even keeping pace with stock decline. I think as anybody who's driven by a Toronto community housing site can see, there's in fact less and less total social housing as time goes on. This has been coupled with insufficient private market supply. Recent figures from our federal housing agency, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, suggest that in 10 years, Ontario's housing shortage is going to reach more than 1 million homes. Obviously, this isn't a figure probably that even very invested governments could meet, and so this is a problem of private sector supply, which I know those three words in a row tend to make people's eyes start glazing over, but this is an important part of the problem. So for years, development has not even come close to keeping pace with population growth. There's a lot of reasons for this. Most significant has been the difficulties and costs in simply building new homes. In the past, we relied on easy and cheap suburb expansion, of which I think Scarborough is a defining example. It's quite easy to build out, build quickly, but we've kind of simply run out of space. Some of this is practical. We're simply getting too far away from each other and too far away from urban centers. And some of it is artificial in the good sense, in the form of, say, the sorely needed greenbelt protections. But in either case, we've run out of places to put cheap houses. The only real option then is to build in and build up, but here extraordinary development fees, high land costs, extremely onerous multi-governmental regulations, and most problematically, concerted mobilization by local groups have really sharply limited our ability to densify and to give new places for people to live. The third cause, and maybe the most esoteric, is really just a shift in how the world's economy works, and with it, how populations and money flow. Economic growth and economic success are increasingly concentrated in city-region cores, of which Toronto is one of the world's leading ones. Put simply, if you want to be successful, or really if you want to get a job, you have to live in a city, or at least in spitting distance of one. And as a result, Canadians are leaving smaller towns and cities and even provinces for a handful of hub regions. And in doing this, they're also being met by a steady stream of global immigrants doing exactly the same thing. At the same time, it's not just people who are crowding in. These twin processes have turned Canadian housing markets into lucrative global financial markets. I don't want to linger too long on this because the scale and effects of the problem are a bit uncertain, but it is clear that at the very least, thousands of homes in Toronto sit empty simply because they're being used as lucrative investment vehicles. So here we have the broad strokes of the problem. Not enough houses, certainly not enough affordable ones, what we could call the supply side of the problem, and ever-growing demand for those that exist, of which includes some which don't actually end up being used, further looping around and contributing to demand. So here, I just want to talk a little bit about why this matters. It's not just about the money, but the money is important. I want to start with a non-obvious one. This is an environmental crisis. People who can't live anywhere else move away from cities. And in doing so, they move to suburbs, they move to rural areas, and their environmental impact just increases exponentially. Put simply, the greenest life in Canada is living in a city. This may seem counterintuitive, but it makes sense if you think that living in a city means that you drive less, if at all. You have a smaller home to heat and cool, less or no lawn to water, and the like. And so one thing I really want to stress today, and one really important takeaway, is that for those of us really concerned about the climate, this is an inseparable issue. That if people have to move away, that the environmental impacts of that are going to continue to be catastrophic. And the best thing you can do then is to densify where we already are. Then, sort of touching on the Ansel reading I talked about earlier, there's political reasons to think about this. Put simply, life in a city makes people more tolerant. And this kind of comes to the Jane Jensen reading. Jane Jensen, no, that's not it. Thank you. Jane Jensen is a sociologist. Jane Jacobs describes a daily interaction with strangers. And this daily exposure to strangers, people who don't look like us, who don't talk like us, who don't pray or even eat like us, is really essential if you want to maintain a multicultural and tolerant society. And this exposure is nearly impossible outside of a city. It's no accident that xenophobia and sort of an incipient far-right movement in Canada are clustered in rural and even suburban areas where difference and different people really remain away from you at all times. So if we want to do something about this, we need to give people an opportunity to see each other, to be exposed to each other every day. And beyond simple tolerance, although I shouldn't call it simple, there's another, maybe even bigger issue. And I'm inevitably going to sound like an alarmist here, so please bear with me. But there's democratic reasons to want to deal with our housing crisis quickly and effectively. As the Ansel reading indicates, those who suffer most in housing crises, those who are both locked out of ownership and nearly bankrupted at the same time from the daily cost of living, are understandably likely going to end up disenfranchised with the society they find themselves in. And you don't have to look too far across time and space, across history, to see that disenfranchised people who see a world that clearly is capable of getting better, but won't for them, look elsewhere for solutions and for people to blame. And today, there's an inarguable connection that the Ansel reading starts getting at between housing insecurity and the anti-democratic far right, which has proven all too eager to seize on the anxieties of a locked-out generation. Again, I'm going to sound a little alarmist here, but I promise you, as a researcher and as a social scientist, that an overwhelming amount of evidence points this way, that maintaining and even improving upon the peaceful, tolerant, liberal, democratic society that we like, that we know can be improved, but at the very least has to be preserved, requires that we find a way to give millions of people somewhere that they can afford to call a home. And so, on that sharply negative note, what can we do about this? And the answer is we can do a lot. This isn't a problem that can't be solved. These are unique causes, but they're causes that we can do something about. And this is where I started thinking, and this is where the West Hill mission statement really came in handy, but how we can do this. Oh, I should have written this down. Grounded in love? Is that? I forget the G's. Growing in love? Grounded? Guided by love. Grounded in life. Okay. Life and love. And so there's a couple ways you can do this that I want to emphasize today in closing. The first, I want to emphasize that housing is actually pretty unique as a policy area for being fundamentally locally controlled. And this means that everybody in this room and everybody on Zoom has a lot of power to control it, to have an impact in their own neighborhoods. The decisions that matter get made on your block by groups of your neighbors and by your city councilors. You can tell them that you want more neighbors, not fewer. Housing politics are dominated by anti-development people, by anti-growth, what we dismissively, I think maybe too dismissively sometimes, called NIMBYs, not in my backyards. But you can be a counter voice to this. You can remind people that bringing in new neighbors is an opportunity to make more vibrant neighborhoods. And maybe even in particular that new social or affordable housing projects can not only make more vibrant neighborhoods, but more loving and fair ones. This takes the form of some deeply boring things. Attending zoning meetings, project proposals, development applications, changes to city plans, and these sorts of things. They're not well advertised. You have to go out and find them. You have to sit in a room, wait for your turn to speak, and spend 30 seconds while people quietly boo you. But it's essential, and it's what you can do. And those voices matter because sometimes all it takes is one positive voice to make a difference, to give a leader, a planner, somebody the sort of courage and the backing up to act. We can also do this work by talking directly to our elected leaders. And if the previous one maybe helps with what I was talking about earlier in the form of supply constraints, talking to our elected leaders can help with our affordable housing constraints. We can make demands of them to do something about this. And I assure you, speaking as somebody who briefly and ingloriously worked in politics, elected leaders listen to these things. They listen when you call and say, "This matters to me." And these are requests they rarely hear and want to hear. So call your MP, your MPP, your councillor, even your trustee, sure, and tell them to invest in more social and affordable housing at all levels of government, and follow up with them and challenge them and tell them that promises and re-announcements aren't enough, that we need more, and we need, and I'm going to keep returning to this theme, more neighbors. And finally, there's a lot going on already, and you can organize and get involved with people organizing. In Toronto, there's dozens of groups active today working on these issues. More Neighbors Toronto, who I've sort of borrowed that theme from, is a group working to reform planning and zoning constraints in the city. There's groups like the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness, who are fighting for improved pathways out of homelessness and improvements to the shelter system. And groups like the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty and ACORN, who are fighting for renewed social housing investments. What I really want to emphasize here, maybe the most important part, is that there's a lot of conflicting arguments about how to solve the housing crisis, and we get too caught up in them sometimes, arguing over, should we build more social housing, should we build more private housing, should we regulate better, et cetera, and there's no bad answers. We need a lot of solutions, and we need a lot of people, even if they're not doing the same thing, rowing in the same direction. So if this matters to you, take your pick, take what's interesting, and start rowing, because the rowing matters, and it makes an impact, brick by brick. And I just want to conclude by saying, in writing this and thinking about this, I really took inspiration from the work that communities like West Hill are already doing. This is not a new set of problems. I mean, I know that West Hill is already presently working to sponsor a refugee and bring them here. Here's where I wish I did my homework and got their name and country, and Tina. Yes. Already recognizing the need for people to have a safe place to call home. Every week I gladly hear Cindy mention the local Indigenous Youth Hub, that again reflects the need for people to have a place, a a safe place to call home, to come back to. So the goal of my talk then isn't to convince you that these things matter. You already know that. What I want to convince you of, and what I'm happy to talk more about later, is simply three things. First, and as you know, we all need a place to call our own. Second, an alarming number of people don't have that and have, at present, no prospect of getting there. And third, and most importantly, you and I, both alone, together, and in whatever organization you choose, have the power to do something about that. So thank you. Sure.
Whoa. That was such a grounded presentation of facts that matter. And we heard it that way. I want you to know that. The trouble with looking at people with masks on is you can't tell how engaged they are. Look at there. There's a little bit of a moment of engagement from people, and on the Zoom as well. And I wanted to extend that, and I'm glad you did, because it's a Canadian problem, but your chart showed it's a worldwide problem. So wherever you are on Zoom, you could relate to these issues. I wanted to ask, we have a couple times, okay for a question or two? May I ask you a question? That was my first one, and I should have asked it quietly. But could you just, first of all, I wanted to say I appreciate how you linked everything to what home is. It's not just an address, it's a place of safety. And that's such a basic thing on our Maslow's triangle, and to realize that not that so many people don't have that basic level of I can go here and be safe. So that's so important. But could you just say a word about, your research is fabulous. The COVID issue, how has that affected, the homeless issues particularly, but if you just had to say a word about COVID in your research, was that how that affects the housing and the attention to it? Is it taking attention away or put it over, that sort of thing?
Sure. I'll take a bit of a hedge answer here and say it's very complex, but there's a couple very obvious consequences. Lots of people lost their jobs or lost work and lost their housing for it. Obviously, there was varying levels of eviction freezes and protections. A friend of mine is doing research that basically showed these delayed the inevitable, and maybe more importantly, really don't stop illegal evictions from happening. A great deal of rental housing in Toronto is illegal for reasons of undersupply, because people don't really have the choice to live elsewhere, and so people weren't protected from that. So from that sort of most direct angle, we saw a sharp rise in homelessness, and we saw a real exacerbation of the market problems we've seen. Some people suddenly found themselves with a lot more disposable income and bought property with it. So a new sort of set of people were locked out as prices escalated. Between those two trends then, what we really saw was, for each kind of problem I talked about, that it just magnified. There's less construction that could be done, there's less funds available and less time available for social housing investment. Shelters closed or went to half capacity. And so the sort of magnifying and pile-on effects of this, I don't think we've quite disentangled yet, but were tremendous.
I don't know if anyone on Zoom or in the room here have a question that they would like to ask, but I'm pretty sure we could all say we found something in there we didn't know. And we found something in there that troubled us to hear. Did someone have something from the Zoom?
Yes, Scott, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Thanks very much for the comment. I agreed with everything you had to say. But one of the questions that came into my mind was, are we seeking ongoing growth of cities forever? I'm just thinking, do we ever say, the number of people we have is sufficient, or we just keep going forever without sort of an end plan in mind, what we're trying to achieve?
Sorry, can you just ask the first part of that question again?
I'm just wondering if we're going to seek ongoing growth into cities forever.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We thought that the answer was no, as we thought the answer was no in the 1950s. We thought the suburbs were the future. We thought the answer was no in the 1990s. We thought that the internet was going to sort of make the world flat and let people live wherever. It seems like it's human nature to want to live in cities. And in fact, it seems like as we're less constrained by sort of the need to live in faraway places by like industry and things, people just increasingly choose to congregate. So with the best crystal ball I can manage, yes, I do think that cities are almost natural. They're like an expression of human activity, and so they're going to continue to grow and continue to concentrate.
I'm just wondering if there's a point when you consider a city to be a bit unmanageable in terms of the size and infrastructure that's required, and whether you'd be better to encourage other locations for cities to develop.
Yes, this is such a good question and such a good problem, interesting problem. And the challenge is that you can only encourage people so far. That if you have money and you have the choice between living in, I'll pick on somewhere I just was, like Pooch Cove, Newfoundland, and downtown Toronto, you're probably not going to choose the place where the only store closes at 6, and you have 3 neighbors, and people are just always going to do that. People are always, it seems, going to be drawn to hubs, and so I think there's a question of how you manage that. And inarguably, this is something Toronto's done a terrible job on, right? And this is something I would have loved to have talked about a bit in the supply constraints section. But what we've done is built a system where you can only basically bring people into the city by building super tall condo towers in a handful of places, which isn't a great life, isn't good for those neighborhoods. While the vast majority of the city remains sort of these rows of old suburban single-family housing. So the question is, how do you find a happy middle there? And I use the word middle deliberately because there's a group of people, advocates, who talk about the missing middle in housing. It's really visible in Toronto. There's no real ability to develop, gentle density. You just have to go up or out. And so, yeah, how do you manage building Toronto up? Like, Toronto's going to get 1 million more people in the next 10 years. The question isn't if they're going to come here. The question is where they're going to live when they do. That's a fundamentally political problem. It's a question of planning and zoning and capacity and willingness. And this is sort of what I probably should have articulated better in closing. It's sort of what we agree to do. And maybe that means, right, fewer people living in downtown Toronto and more people living around Scarborough Town Centre, North York Civic Centre, sort of distributing people out better. But you have to plan that and reflect human nature while doing that.
I just want to say, James, that the city that Florence is standing in front of is not where she lives. If you notice, this very ancient, beautiful city is not hers. If there's anyone else, please pop on. We've got the time for another question if you wish to ask something or comment. Anne, you come right here.
I found your talk just fascinating, and it was a really timely thing. Just yesterday, afterwards, we talked about family issues, and she has a sister who lives very rurally who visited recently, and her sister said to her, "I don't know how you live with all these neighbors." And my girlfriend's response was, "I don't know how you live without neighbors." And it seemed, the part that it was really interesting that you said was that the political divide and between those rural without neighbors and those in cities, and how that divide, that might have been another consequence of COVID. That divide seems to be getting greater, and the political divide is greater there. I don't know if I have a question. I'm just fascinated with that. And I just wanted to remark on it. And I mean, I see the same thing with my own relatives who are in isolated urban centers. And with COVID in particular, the more you're in that environment, the less, I don't know if the word's confident or able you are to go out and be friendly with strangers, and that's where Jane Jacobs' work was so vital. I'm a real fan of her philosophy. Anyway, is there a question there? But thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk.
Well, it's an adapted academic presentation, so a comment in lieu of a question is perfectly appropriate.
Walter, come here quickly. Step up to the microphone and share.
In your estimation, would Jane Jacobs come to live in Toronto now? Sorry. And one other question I'd put to you. Water. How do you see large urban centers getting enough fresh water for the human people to live?
Yeah, these are two very interesting questions on two very different poles. I think Jane Jacobs would come back to Toronto. I think for its many flaws, which I'll gladly harp on about, it remains like sort of the quintessential city that she described. I mean, remains a city of neighborhoods. Here's where I'll kind of expose myself as somebody who is probably on the whole anti-Jane Jacobs, or thinks her long-term impact has ultimately been negative, because the sort of local democratic controls that she really advocated for are the reason why a city like Toronto has its tall and sprawl development. So, you know, not to sound snide in that, but she'd love it here. She still would. It's still the city that she sort of advocated for and built. And I like to think that in the same way that, you know, she went against the received wisdom of the 1960s, maybe, you know, if she was reborn, she'd update again and be somebody who, you know, sort of is one of those rare thinkers who's very good at looking at the world and kind of diagnosing the problem of the day. As for water, you have to live in Toronto or Montreal or Chicago, or like there's really no choice for dealing with water that doesn't involve living in cities, because simply put, as I said earlier, you use less water in cities. There's only so much fresh water in the world, and it fortunately is concentrated in a few big piles, so you have to match that with people and move a bunch of people into small little water using lives and hope that works. I realize that's a deeply unsatisfying and slightly dystopian answer, but certainly there's no future of water security that includes suburban lawns. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You know, we're really fortunate in a way. There's probably nowhere on Earth more suitable for climate adaptability than Toronto. We're near an incredible body of fresh water. We're sort of protected from winter and protected from summer. And what that adaptability means is that there are billions of people in the world who are going to need and to come and live places like this. And that's, I think, probably, again, to slip into alarmism maybe, going to be the big political problem of the next decades, and how we manage that, and frankly, how we fit them here is an obligation and a problem.
I am so glad we have heard facts, we have heard values, we have heard disagreement, we have heard questions, and we have heard comments, and that makes for a very good time together. So I'm glad you had the time today to share with us.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.